Boy, am I glad to see you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Dan Grabois. I'm the curator and founder of the SoundWaves series. This is the beginning of our second decade of SoundWaves. Yeah, thank you. It's also the beginning of my second decade as a professor here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before that, I lived in the city of New York, which is our topic today. I'm just curious, in the live audience here, has any of you lived in New York? So a bunch of you have lived in New York, and it's quite a city, and we're going to be exploring some aspects of the city that maybe you haven't thought about. It's funny because this thought used to occur to me that was one of the things that gave rise to hatching the scheme of having SoundWaves. I imagined myself traveling back in the past and going to some society, small society of people, and they'd be asking me, what's life like in the future? And I'd say, well, it's amazing. First of all, we can go wherever we want because we have these things called cars. And they would say, what's that? And I would say, I would sort of draw a picture, and I would say, it rides on these tires. What's a tire? Well, it's this circular thing made out of rubber. What's rubber? And when you get to the most basic level, I realized the answer to every question is, I don't know. So we drive on a road. Well, what's a road? Well, it's this thing that connects two places. Well, how do you make it? You make it out of asphalt. What's asphalt? I don't know. No idea. And so I actually found an asphalt expert to talk about New York. And we're going to get lots of basic questions answered about our world, hopefully things that we never thought of. And for those of you who are SoundWaves regulars, and I see a lot of you, and thank you for coming back, you know that we like to try to reveal answers to questions that maybe you would have never thought to ask. So we have technically, it's a little bit of a complicated presentation here. I'll be obviously speaking here live, and Robbie Weber will be speaking live, and the other three presenters will be speaking via Zoom, and we have all these screens. So, and then the musicians are here playing live. So when the big screen is down, I think you'll be seeing the slide presentation on the big screen and the actual presenters on the side screens. So you may want to move your attention side to side. And the brilliant tech staff here is making all of this happen. And I'd like to thank them very much for that. Later in this presentation, I'll be telling you about a career for a musician in New York, and the musician will be me because that's the career that I know. But I will tell you that I did play in a big band for a few years, and there was this great sax player in the big band. His name was Arun Luthra, and the band leader was a composer who wrote most of the tunes named Thomas Granet. And I loved playing in this band. I had never been a member of a big band before. Playing in the jazz style was something that I was never trained to do and had to learn on the fly, which is going to be kind of a theme of my presentation. And so imagine my delight when I learned that our visiting interdisciplinary artist this semester was going to be Arun Luthra. And so I was visiting with my friend Johannes Wallman, who's over here. And I said, is this possible that this is the same Arun Luthra that I used to play in a big band with in New York? And he said, probably, because how many sax playing Arun Luthra could there be? And sure enough, we reconnected, and Arun was kind enough to have a band and himself come and play at the SoundWaves. Unusually for SoundWaves, we'll start with a short set of music. Then we'll drop the screen, have the presentations. We'll raise the screen up again, and we'll have another longer set of music. So we get a music sandwich. So it is with great pleasure that I bring on stage Arun Luthra with his band of musicians. Thank you.
Merci, Dan. Hello, everybody. Hi, everyone in internet land. So we're going to start the program off with a series of short pieces which were commissioned by a series producer for a radio program called Performance Today. Maybe some of you know it. It's put out by Minnesota Public Radio. And this series producer's name is Jocelyn Frank. And she said, Arun, we've got these found sounds that our listeners have recorded throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. And we're going to give you these sounds, and then we want you to make some music out of it. And I said, okay, let's do it. So this is what you're about to hear. And this is very special for me because we recorded this and it was broadcast on the radio, but it's never been performed live before. So this is a world premiere performance. So we'll start with a piece called Omni Joy for the Borough of Queens. And I called it that because the found sounds we use is just all these people talking with all these different accents and languages. And I thought, wow, omni, meaning everything, you know, so just joy in all ways, in all cultures throughout humanity. Then we'll play a piece called Staten Island, Charlie's World of Wonders. And you'll soon figure out why it's called that. Then the next piece is called Manhattan Subterranean Daydream. Most of us, when we think of the New York City subway, we think of hustle and bustle and loud noises. But to me, the found sounds that I used evoked the idea of sitting on the train and just closing your eyes and kind of drifting off into dreamland between stops. So it's called Subterranean Daydream. Then we're going to play Brooklyn Runners and Riders, which refers to the New York City Marathon. And we'll hear some found sounds of the people cheering the marathon runners on, and then the world famous Brooklyn Cyclone roller coaster. And that's what the Riders refers to. And then lastly, we'll hear the Bronx Courtly Groove, and courtly in the sense of a basketball court. All right, here we go.
Charlie, what are you smelling back there?
Oh, Charlie's having a
Charlie.
Taka takita taka takita takademi takita taka tarikidum taka tadim tadim takidum takidum ta di ginaton taka tarikidum tatum tikinaton ta takidum tarikidum takidum tarikidum 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 ta.
Daddy, come on, man. When you listen, you can drink.
Tom, the Katakadina, Takadina, Takata, Tom, the Katakadina, Takadina, Takata, Tom, the Patikina, Patikina, Tom, the Patikina, Patikina, Tom, the Katakadina, Takadina, Takata, Tom, the Katakadina, Takadina, Tom, the Patikina, Patikina, Takita, Takita, Tom, the Patikina, Patikita, Tom, the Takadina, the Takadina, the Takadina, 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 Tom, the Takadina, the Takadina, Tom, the Takadina, Takita, 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 Tom, the Takadina, Takadina, Tom, the Takita, 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 Tom, the Takita, Takita, Tom, the Tom, they get out of that.
Thank you. Matt Anderson on the drum set, John Christensen on the contrabass, Johannes Wallman on the keyboard. My name is Arun Luthra. Thank you, Dan, for having us.
Thank you to the band. Fantastic. We'll be seeing you in a few minutes. Okay, we're going to start with the lectures now. And as always, as you've come to expect at SoundWaves, we have brilliant people speaking with you, and it is an honor to welcome them all, starting with Joel Rogers, who you see at the bottom of the screen there. And Joel's affiliations run to a lengthy list: the law school, the Department of Political Science, Public Affairs and Sociology, and COWS cows, which I'm not sure what it stands for, but I'm sure Joel will tell us. So I turned it over to you, Joel. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me try to share my screen here with everyone. Okay, can all you guys see that? If someone could give me a heads up. I hope you can. Yeah, I am Joel Rogers, and I'm affiliated with all those departments. COWS used to stand for something. The acronym used to stand for something. It doesn't anymore. Just think of us as a nice ruminant herbivore creating non-inflammatory milk for democratic movements in Wisconsin and elsewhere. We're non-inflammatory as well, and we don't emit any methane, so we don't burp or fart in an obnoxious way. But we are a university center, and we promote high road economic solutions to a variety of problems. I'm going to allude to high road a little bit later, and I put these things on my deck, and they're shared with Dan and Shauna, and you're welcome to take them if they can get those to you. And then the other is EPIC Network. The acronym does stand for something. The name was chosen simply to reduce that magisterial acronym. It stands for the Educational Partnerships for Innovation in Communities. And that's a big network of now 70 going on 90 pretty soon universities worldwide that promote, including about 50 in the US, that promote the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll also be alluding to later. And there's my, if you need to find me, I'm easy to find, that's how to find me. Okay, so my message to you today is pretty simple, and I have the advantage of starting out. I'm not going to be talking much about New York City, which is, I lived there for many years and love it and hate it and instructed by it every time I go back. But about cities in general, and here's the message: that we, meaning our species, Homo sapiens, are very rapidly urbanizing at an increasing pace, and we're still a fairly young species, about 300,000 years old now, but we are now, more or less metro sapiens, a city-based species, rather than simply wandering around in savannas or in rural areas. There are still some people in rural areas, but we are increasingly in cities. And that is very good news, assuming we're not in the meantime flooded out by, sunny day flooding or dark day flooding. It's very good news for our species flourishing, not just survival, but real flourishing. It promises a very clear, bright future of our living better together and with the nature that we're in the process of sort of destroying now. But we are destroying the world around us. We've got to mend our ways. And somehow accepting the fact that we have these ancient fairly ancient Pleistocene epoch brains, we've got to improve our self-organization and behavior. We're currently sort of an outbreak species that has escaped any niche that we might have been in. And we're currently at real danger to ourselves and other life. And time is sort of running out on our stupidity and greed. So having issued that warning, let me issue an assurance as well, and I'll do that later in the talk. We can do this. We can turn this catastrophe around. We know what's needed and how to do it. and could obviously learn more. There's a bunch of innovation that's still needed by doing it. But it's urgent that we start doing it more or less now. It's time to wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up for life now. And natural place to begin to do that is where we live, and we live increasingly in cities. Okay, so on Metro Sapiens, here you see, going back 12,000 years, the urban share of the global population. And as you see, it's pretty flat. It's well below 10%, even 5%, until late in or midway through the 19th century. And then it's accelerated very, very rapidly since. Right now, we're at around 50%, a little bit more than 50%. By within the lifetimes of most people here, that is by 2050, we should be at around 75, approaching 80%. That's an incredible change, which has gone on in our lifetimes, along with internationalization and digitalization and all these wild advances in health sciences, urbanization. Think Metro Sapiens. Here's a closer in picture of it, where you can see the 19th century acceleration more better. Here's an even closer in picture where you can see how recently it was worldwide that the urban population exceeded the rural population. This is a relatively new thing that's happened, and I don't think we've really made sense of it or come to appreciate it in our politics nearly as much as we should. Now, cities are, the oldest form of human settlement, and there are cities that have been around for, well, more than 10,000 years. But their fantastic recent growth owes not just to the discovery of that drill pipe that allowed us to to plunder the ghosts of carbon plants in the past, i.e. the successful commercialization of oil around right the time the cities began to take off, and around the time that world population or increases in living standards in the world population exploded. But cities are sort of humanity's greatest invention. I'd add maybe fiat currency, sort of as a joke, to that list of great things. But they are, because they are much more productive than other ways of settling ourselves. And why are they more productive? Because the basis of most growth is us. It's our human capital, our exchange with other people, our interrogation, our swapping of skills that are getting better by being near other people. And cities enable that. They enable a lot of exchange, learning, what economists like to call agglomeration effects, or glomming together of people and firms effects, the positive effects in terms of increasing returns to investment that follow from density. But density is not just good for the economy, it also makes us better. It makes us more tolerant and more other regarding. And that's partly a function of necessity. If you're around a bunch of neighbors that you can't all shoot, you got to figure out a way to get along with them a little bit better. But it's also because of the fantastic opportunity and mutual attraction. And remember, cities are famously marriage markets for our young folks. But more seriously, there's very little that people do not enjoy more than killing time with other people in varied ways. And cities present tremendous opportunities to do those things. But cities are a little bit less or more materially, let's say, are also a great platform for public goods. Public goods are goods which are non-exclusive. Everybody gets them. No one can be excluded from them. And they're non-rival. Their quality is not diminished by consumption of them. Think about clean air, or think about national defense, or a good public education system, or any number of things that are provided to all. In a way that does not diminish their value to any individual consumer of them. And cities are great platforms for public goods because of their density. There are more people there to pay for their provision in a given place. And also because of their location efficiencies. You know, a mile of pipe is going to cost the same whether it feeds or distributes stuff to 2 households or 20 or 200 or 2,000 or 20,000. And that location efficiency, getting more from the investments that you make, the physical investments, but also the service investments, is the other great thing about cities and public goods. Now, this is great news. Here's the good news with a big catch or caution. It's a great news because cities promise, especially if equipped with ongoing advances in basic knowledge about, about the world and ourselves, and then material tech, the 5G world that's coming at us and is already in part arrived, infotech and biotech. It was amazing what, it took Moderna, 18 hours to get the most effective vaccine for the plague. The Internet of Things, sensors everywhere and things talking to each other. Material sciences, new materials that can be produced much more efficiently and last much longer. And then social tech, user-centered design, organized or facilitated exchange, a variety of innovations in politics. I'm sorry for the acronyms here, but that's proportional representation, ranked choice voting, citizen assemblies, quadratic voting, quadratic finance. But the last two things are basically ways of getting people to agree on doing things together that takes into account outlier views, but manages to get to consensus in them. And all those things together give us the opportunity for a fantastically richer and more equally shared life together. Think again about those public goods I mentioned before. Think about democratic public goods in particular. So public goods in housing, health, education, communication, mobility, recreation, etc., but make them in a democratic way, in the sense that they're provided with a view not just to providing the service or the whatever, but also to fostering a strongly democratic public. And if you do that, then that public can be counted on, I believe, or we believe, the world, I think, should believe, to check any concern you have about an overreaching Leviathan type state, but also improved in their design by that same public. And it also, urbanization, which takes up a very shockingly low area, small area of space. We're talking about, the population will probably peak at around 10 billion people. We're talking about 80, maybe 85%. Those 8 billion people, let's say, hypothetically, we're not quite there yet right now. But let's say you're going to have 8 billion people crowded together on basically 1% of the world's surface area, about less than 3% of the land surface area, and that's going to be quite good for helping out not invading the habitat of the many other species in the world that we're in the process of destroying. And it will also, I think, improve relations, or could improve relations, with those people who are outside the urban areas, that I'll class them simply as rural populations, who can be, given this greater wealth in particular, much better rewarded, not just for food and outdoor recreation possibilities, but for restoring and stewarding nature. So that's a pretty happy picture. The catch or caution is that there's no city or nation in the world that's yet close to redeeming that promise. The promise of cities is widely not redeemed. Of course, that doesn't settle the matter, but it does describe some work that needs to get done. So looking at all the damage that we're doing in the world, I see no grounds for desperation or despair, but lots of grounds for exertion and real diligence. And when you go to cities themselves, when you look at how can we repair them, and people will be talking about New York City and other cities and what needs to be done by repair. Cities in general operate in a not very friendly political universe. They're exploited widely. They produce all this wealth, and other people take it. They're envied, they're feared, they're loathed by others. Of course, it goes both ways. And, I'm quite familiar and try to argue against all the time that urban dwellers, the contempt they show for other people. But the anti-city bias of a lot of policy in the world is particularly so in the US. Here we have this incredibly auto-dependent culture, which leads to sprawl outside of the cities. We've got Brazilians sometimes rival us and a few other countries rival us. We have an unbelievable history on racism, violent racism, which often leads people to think that cities are condemned to a sort of iron law of urban decay, that even successful cities will fail because as incomes rise, populations move out, evacuating the wealth from the core. We have very weak home rule. We have a very competitive federalism in the US, and states are always beating up on cities, and particularly so now, limiting their power to organize their own affairs. And then, of course, we live in a profoundly undemocratic political system in which a donor class is basically running the parties, and the parties are not behaving in a particularly responsible way. Of course, cities are not without blame themselves. We've all relearned Intruder in the Dusts, the Temple Drake effects, the racism, other exclusions and oppressions, which have not died and indeed are still present, inertia, dysfunctional organization, ordinary stupidities and corruptions, etc. Cities are guilty of all those things. But now they also face skyrocketing inequality, environmental crises, broader democratic failure, right-wing authoritarianism, and then the polarization, social anomie, all of which have a combinatorial effect. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we have proven solutions to all these problems. We know how to finance, govern, develop our cities much better, taking the high road of urban development to the UN SDGs and beyond. Now, just 2 minutes, I promise, on high road and SDGs, and I'll get out of here. So what is high road about? Well, basically, there are two ways under competitive capitalism to make a boatload of money. One is you could treat people like roadkill and the earth like a sewer, and democratic government is something to weaken and mock while you extract rents from it, as many rents from it as you can. I'll call that the low road. Or you can use democratic organization inside and outside the state to reduce waste all over the place, which is all over the place, add value, and capture and share the benefits of doing both locally, where local means community, region, or could be nation. And that's basically what COWS is about. I'll call that the high road. If you go there, you'll see again and again examples of where firms have made or not made the competitive choice that they need to make to get on the high road. They can go on the low road, which basically means focusing first on price, which produces a bunch of very familiar bad stuff, or they can focus on quality distinctiveness for which customers are willing to pay a premium, which produces a lot of good stuff. And the good stuff is, all the stuff that you'd like to see in your society. It also, though, implies a choice for communities to develop or not higher public standards on private performance, and then supports in meeting them, to close off the low road, to help pave the high road, and then to enable those stuck on the first to go get to and then stay on the second. But that can be done. If you go to the COWS website, you'll see a zillion examples of that. You can also measure this. Don't worry about that. This is what we do with public officials all over the country and sometimes the world. You can measure it for establishments and firms, and you can measure it for communities as well. Pretty easy to measure. It's not really that hard, in fact, to tell the difference between low road and high road firms or communities or states or nations. Here's two animals. If you can tell the difference between them, then you can probably tell the difference. What about SDGs? And this refers to the second organization in my title slide. What are the SDGs? They're basically 17 goals that, if you read them, you'll be impressed by that a fantastic number of nations have committed to achieve by the end of this decade, by 2030. They're not going to get there, but the fact that they want to do these things as quickly as they want to do is the sort of hypocrisy that vice pays to virtue. And cities are trying to do this. I give you a reference there to latest report card on how cities are doing it. So certainly your mayor here in Mass and Satya Kama used to work for me at COWS, is trying to do it. And Epic N, that other thing I referred to, or Epic Network, has done, in the last 10 years or so, about 1,700 SDG promoting projects in wildly demographically and politically diverse neighborhoods. So it can be done. So certainly freed by a more democratic federalism, I allude there to a recent paper by me and Zab Briggs, a guy who used to work for Obama and then before Obama, Clinton, and a number of other people. We can do this with a more democratic federalism. All we need is an army of concerned citizens willing to act locally, a national government willing to act for its own people and contribute then internationally to international public goods, the greatest of which is peace, and a boatload of clean energy, which is, I believe, on its way pretty soon. But again and forever, it starts with deep appreciation of the fact that unless we get cities right, humanity, not just New York City, is in deep trouble and is running out of time. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joel. And thank you for the message of ultimately optimism, which at the beginning sounded like it would be a message of cynicism. That's New York for you right there.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Michael Notaro from the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. His talk is entitled Climate Change in New York City, the Growing Storm. So don't get too optimistic.
All right, so I'm Michael Notaro, the Associate Director of the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'll be speaking about climate change in New York City, the growing storm. And as a background, I grew up in New York City, so I lived there for the first 18 years of my life, making this a personal topic. One of the things I want to point out is how the fact that literally records are falling by the week and by the day. So for example, back in 2021, earlier this year, Hurricane Henry produced a record of 1.94 inches of rainfall in just an hour in New York City. And literally 11 days later, Hurricane Ida came through in September, producing a new record of 1 hour rainfall of 3.15 inches. So within a couple of weeks' time, breaking the record a second time. This is a figure that comes from the New York City Panel on Climate Change 2019 report executive summary, showing historical and projected annual temperature and precipitation for Central Park. And the projections are showing a warming of anywhere from 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century for New York City, and also a projected increase in annual precipitation. I also want to comment that the bigger concern is the fact that precipitation is becoming more extreme over time. So the general story is warmer, wetter, and more extreme. Likewise, if you look at a study by Horton, they project for New York City an annual increase of 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by the middle of the century and 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the 2080s. And likewise, an increase in annual precipitation anywhere from up to 10% by the mid and late 21st century. This table shows changes in extremes in temperature and precipitation. So for example, New York City typically will exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit, a really hot day, about 4 times a year. By the time the 2080s show up, that might occur anywhere from 12 to 32 days per year. So that tells us two things. One, that's much more frequent extreme heat and a serious concern. The other thing is by the fact that there's a large range, if we apply a lot of mitigation, potentially we could get a more favorable emission scenario where we get just a more modest increase as opposed to something more extreme, such as several weeks a year over 95 degrees. Then likewise, typically New York City will get heavy rainfall events of at least 2 inches about 3 times a year. By the 2080s, that might be occurring more like 4 to 5 times a year. So more frequent and more intense heavy precipitation events or flooding, kind of like the figure I showed earlier on related to those hurricanes. So here I want to show an image from an article, Fitzpatrick, and a website from the University of Maryland which asks the question is, what will New York City's climate resemble in 60 years under current high emission rates? And for high emissions, New York City's climate in 2080 is likely to feel more like today's climate of Jonesboro, Arkansas. So if you could picture the climate of Arkansas moving up to New York City. Likewise, if we look at a report by Con Edison for climate change vulnerability study, we can show the growing frequency of heat waves in New York. And the left figure is showing a moderate emission scenario, greenhouse gases. The right figure is showing a high-end emission scenario, greenhouse gases. We know that multi-day heat waves are potential risks that drive demand for air conditioning and stress infrastructure and electrical systems. Here they define a heat wave as 3 or more days consecutive with daily mean temperatures of at least 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're projecting for Central Park by the 2080s, up to 15 to 35 events per year, depending on the emission scenario. So a substantial increase in the frequency and intensity of these heat waves hitting New York City with huge human impacts on health. The study by Ortiz shows high resolution projections of extreme heat in New York City. Heat wave, and the figure on the left is showing actually projected anomalies in median heat wave intensity, and on the right is heat wave duration anomalies going into the future. Keep in mind 4.5 for the RPC, that's a moderate emission scenario, and RCP 8.5 is a high-end emission scenario. And the top row is showing by the mid-century, and the bottom row is by the late century. So heat wave intensity changes are expected to be the highest closer to the coast, where afternoon sea breezes typically in the past have mitigated summer high temperatures. So those coastal areas that are a little safer from extreme heat will no longer provide refuge. Likewise, the largest increase in heat event duration are projected for Manhattan, which is known for its dense and tall urban canopy. So here I'm talking about some of the results in a report, Summer in the City, improving community resilience to extreme summertime heat in northern Manhattan. Extreme heat waves in New York City are projected to increase in intensity, duration, and frequency. That's a threat to human health, especially for vulnerable populations, and that may include elderly, people with low income, and people with pre-existing medical conditions. Also in New York City, we know people of color often live in areas characterized by abundant heat retaining surfaces and also lack of canopied vegetation. And as a result, those areas tend to be more prone to extreme heat risk. Likewise, high-end emission scenarios of greenhouse gases suggest an increase of annual premature deaths due to extreme heat for the New York metro area of about 83% by the 2050s compared to the 1990s. So that's become a serious threat. This is showing figures from a GRL article projecting changes in societally impactful northeastern US snowstorms. And we're showing the mean seasonal cycle of snowstorms occurring in the Northeast United States. The left figure is for all snowstorms, and the right figure is for major snowstorms. And this is showing that there's a projected future decline in snowstorm frequency and also the length of the snow season, but it's uncertain what will happen with the heaviest snowstorm events. So you'll have a shorter winter season of snow, less frequent snow, but it's unclear if we'll have a change in the intensity of the strongest storms. And now let's move on to flooding. So this article from Garner talks about the impacts of climate change on New York City's coastal flood hazard. And some of the conclusions that they made is projected sea level rise will cause overall flood heights associated with tropical cyclones in the city in coming centuries to increase greatly compared with pre-industrial and modern flood heights. So, for example, during the pre-industrial era, we have flood height return periods of about 500 years, changing at present day to 25 years, and projected in the next few decades, say 3 decades, to changing to 5 years. So those extreme flood-producing storms becoming so prominent that they're occurring every few years, as opposed to every few centuries. I'm going to show some graphics from coastal.climatecentral.org, which is showing projected sea level rise for different global temperature increases. We'll start, for example, showing in the left is Manhattan, and the top right is lower Manhattan zoomed in. is what happens if you had a 2 degrees Celsius global temperature rise. That is very modest. It's a very small amount that would really be difficult to achieve. But even under that scenario, we see that, for example, South Street Seaport becoming underwater. If we move on to, say, a 3 degrees global warming scenario, which is also be tough to reach, but a goal that we can target, in that case, now we start seeing Canal Street underwater. If we go up to a 4 degrees Celsius global warming, at this point, now we even have Wall Street underwater, and that'll definitely get businesses' attention. And in fact, not much of lower Manhattan left. It's turned into a small island. Likewise, we got some pretty amazing figures from Climate Central. If you go to coastal.climatecentral.org, it shows images of major features around the world, major monuments, and what things would look like in the future with sea level rise. And we'll start off with a projected sea level rise due to just a modest 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. And here you can see that's a scenario in which we really have to sharply cut our carbon pollutions globally. And on the right, you can see in this case, at least there's some ground to walk on. Things change though. If you get to a 2 degrees Celsius global warming, things are starting to disappear. This is a scenario in which we cut carbon pollution some. If we start to get a more modest or significant warming of 3 degrees Celsius, this is what we can expect. This is more aligned with what we're actually currently producing. Move on to 4 degrees Celsius. At this point, that's unchecked carbon pollution. And at this point, we have water levels almost to the top of the pedestal of Lady Liberty. We start seeing serious impacts here. Moving on to a New York City Panel on Climate Change 2019 report. This talks about the social vulnerability index for New York City based on socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. This gets into the topic of climate equity and social vulnerability. Social vulnerability to climate change hazards is not evenly distributed, especially across New York City. You have higher levels of social vulnerability in areas of lower income and areas of higher shares of African American and Hispanic residents. So those who are dealing with already current challenges facing higher vulnerabilities related to climate change. So I wrap up with the final statement in which I want to state that the threat of climate change is real, the science is clear, the time to act is now. We cannot allow the greatness of New York City to fall to the rising sea or the devastation of a warming climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next presenter is right here, coming up onto the stage. This is Robbie Weber, who is, I think, now retired director. Were you the director?
No, I was not the director.
The State Smart Transportation Initiative. And so please welcome Robbie Weber.
So in the meantime, while we're working on that, I will say that I am retired from State Smart Transportation Initiative, which is part of PALS. And so everything that I say is my own opinion. Please do not attribute it to any organization that I may or may not have been affiliated with or are affiliated with right now. The other caveat that I'm going to mention is that I'm going to talk mostly about Manhattan when we talk about traffic, because it's the most congested area that we usually think about as having the biggest transportation and traffic issues. I don't want you to think that I don't recognize there are other parts of New York City. So when Dan asked me to do this talk, I was a little resistant because I don't know New York that well. It's been a long time since I've visited, and I knew that there were people who knew it much better than I do. And I also said, you know, you want me to talk about traffic? It'll just be a rant about how we should get rid of personal vehicles. I mean, that's the way you get rid of traffic. You can see that I put traffic in quotes, and that's why. So I'm actually gonna remind myself I'm gonna set a timer so that I get over time. So he said, I want you to do it anyway. So, okay, fine. So here we go. And I also want you to think a little bit about some lessons that we here in Madison might take from New York. We're not New York, obviously, but we do have some similarities. We have a relatively dense downtown, dense for the size of city that we are, that is constrained geographically by water. And we are looking at a lot of transportation issues here in Madison. And so maybe there are lessons that we can take from New York. So as I said, I didn't know New York very well, and I wanted to just go on a rant about how we should get rid of personal cars. Fortunately, as I started thinking about this, the New York Times came to my rescue and published the article that's on the left, which essentially affirmed most of what I was going to say anyway. So I think if the New York Times agrees with what my instincts were on how to deal with traffic, I must be on the right track. They also, just earlier this fall, published an article about congestion pricing, because this is going to come to New York City. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it is. But if you're interested in some of their opinions on what to do about traffic, these two articles would be a good place to start. So let's look at what encourages people to drive. In general, people like the convenience. They can call their stuff in the car. They can lock it up. They can go whenever they want to. They can play the music they want at the temperature that they want. But sometimes it's a lack of alternatives. Maybe we don't have good ways of getting around. Most of the US is built without a way to get somewhere without a car. In some cases, cost. Well, cars are expensive, but once you've bought it, that individual trip is a very small marginal cost. If you've already got a car and you're going to take one trip, it's not that expensive to take that one trip if you already own the car. Safety. Sometimes people are worried about their own personal safety. They're worried about getting attacked. They like to lock the doors. If you're on a bike or even walking, people are worried about being hit by other cars. You know, parents drive their kids to school because it's not safe for the kids to walk. Well, it's not safe for the kids to walk because all the parents are driving their kids to school, especially around the school. That's a whole different talk, by the way. And then it's what we do. We just drive everywhere in this country. So then what discourages people from driving? Well, in New York City, having a car is kind of a pain. Where are you going to park it? It doesn't go very fast. There's all these other people on the road. It's really not that convenient. There are better alternatives. And cost is a big factor, especially parking. It's very expensive. It's one of the reasons that people don't own cars. And it's what we do. We don't drive in New York City because everybody you know uses a different way to get around. So I wanted to introduce you to Sam Schwartz, who is known as Gridlock Sam. He was the traffic commissioner from 1982 to 1986, and then he was second in command when New York City created the Department of Transportation. And at one point, there was going to be a transit strike, or there was a threat of a transit strike. And his colleagues said, what would happen if we didn't have transit? And he said, well, if everybody's trying to drive, the grid would probably lock up. We wouldn't be able to move. And he actually created the term gridlock. And he was an early proponent of congestion pricing, and he was also an early proponent of bike lanes and public plazas, way before people started talking about these things. Unfortunately, not a lot of people paid attention to him at the time. Mayor Lindsay vetoed the bike lanes and public plazas. And his ideas are not coming back into fashion and are very well accepted. He is a private consultant. He's still around. He's still talking about how to solve traffic problems in cities. So let's look at what the problem of traffic is. You can see here 200 people in 177 cars. The street is pretty crowded and there's not a lot of space. But you take those 200 people out of the cars and there's a lot of space. We're running around with big metal boxes around us. There's actually a lot of space on the street. Put them on 3 buses. There's also a lot of space. And the same thing if you put them on bikes. So the problem is the big metal boxes, not the people coming into the city. And sometimes people say, well, this is where I'm not sure it's going to work. People say, well, what about speed? You know, it takes a lot of time to get to the, right? Yeah, I'm trying to find this is a video and we were having a little trouble getting it to run. I don't know where that. Oh, there we go. Okay. So while this is running, it's only a couple of seconds. It's only a couple of minutes. This is 200 people in 5 different modes of travel. They're all starting at the line. And we think about, well, you know, walking and biking isn't very fast. But when they start moving, yes, okay, it's moving. Those 200 people, and in this case, there are 133 cars. Look at how much space they take up compared to the people who are walking. And then look at how long it takes for them to cross that line. So we have 133 cars. We have, I believe it was 10 buses. We have 5 trams or light rail cars. We have people on bikes and we have people walking. Oh, the people walking already crossed the line. The tram crossed the line and the buses crossed the line. It takes the bicyclists about 2 minutes. It takes the cars almost 4 minutes to cross that line. So this is at a stop as people start driving. It takes twice as long to get 200 people across in a car, and it takes 8 times as long almost as in a bus or a tram. So you can move a lot more people a lot faster if you don't have them driving. Right now we got to figure out how to get out of it. Yeah. Here's mine. Thank you. So one of the things that New York is probably going to do, and one of the things that's been very controversial, and a lot of cities have looked at it, is congestion pricing. So congestion pricing has already been implemented in a number of cities around the world, and New York is going to do it. They just are working out the details. Now, in this case, congestion pricing it's probably best known in London, which is this is a photo from London, where if you drive into the most crowded part of the city, you have to pay a fee to enter that crowded area. And in some cases, there are lower fees for off-peak hours, weekends or holidays or something like that, and you pay more when it's like 9 to 5 on weekdays. You can also do this on highways. You can toll lanes based on how crowded those lanes are. And that is actually done right now in the United States in various places. I was just in Salt Lake City and it was, if I wanted to get the express lane, it was 25 cents because I was driving there on a weekend. But during the week, it probably would have been a couple of dollars to get into the express lane. So what they're going to do in New York is most likely they are going to charge people to enter below a certain street. I don't know what it is. I think they're still working on it. You're coming in from another part of the city or outstate or something like that, and you want to enter Lower Manhattan, you're going to have to pay a fee. People who live there and own cars don't have to pay the fee unless they leave and then come back in again. Okay? So, you know, there's a lot of discussion about this. How much should it be? Who should have to pay? Is this fair? And there's a lot of concern. Some people are concerned about equity. But the people who don't have a lot of money probably don't own cars because, again, owning a car in New York City is very expensive. And giving them an alternative to driving is probably a much better solution. Sorry. So what do we get with congestion pricing? We get fewer people driving into the densest part of the city. We get less noise, less pollution, less emissions, less traffic. We also get a safer city because in many cases, people don't want to. I'm a bicycle advocate. I'm on the board of directors for Madison Bikes. People don't want to bike because they're afraid of drivers hitting them. Even pedestrians sometimes are worried about crossing the street. It's very unsafe with a lot of traffic. So you get a safer city. You get a quieter city, you get a calmer city. I'm missing some slides. Oh, that's interesting. There's a whole bunch of slides in there. That's too bad because I had all these photos of some other things that you could get. The other thing you get with congestion pricing, the money that goes for the congestion pricing can be used to improve transit. So we don't just penalize people for driving in, we also improve the alternatives. We have bike lanes, we have transit lanes, we have improved transit. It's cleaner, it's more attractive, and so you actually can have more alternatives. You also just have more space for people. So I had all these lovely pictures of plazas and people playing, kids playing in the street and people eating outside. We've done this in Madison. We've got the Streeteries program where we took parking off the street and allowed people to, restaurants to have some tables out there. So there's a lot of things you can do with that public space. Think about all that space that we had when we took people out of the cars. There's a lot of things we can do with that space. We can make the buses run faster. I know that in New York, people don't ride the bus because they get stuck in traffic. Well, if we give them their own lane, they're going to run faster. And we won't get rid of all, we're never going to get rid of all personal or small motor vehicles because we've got people with disabilities, we've got Uber and Lyft, we've got delivery vehicles, we've got taxi cabs, we've got food delivery, and people will drive into the city. It's just that we're going to make it less attractive to drive into the city, and we're going to make it expensive to drive into the city, and then take that money and make the alternatives better. And that's how you get rid of traffic. So that is it. Thank you.
So as promised, Hussain Bahia, who has really devoted his career to asphalt. I couldn't believe my luck when I found him looking for a civil engineer who could speak with us. Building better asphalt roads to reduce traffic congestion. And Hussain, please unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my interest in my research. I am a professor at the Civil and Environmental Engineering program. And believe it or not, most of what I do is teach students about how to build roads. And I love to do research on how to improve the black material that we use for our roads. So I'm going to talk about some of the problems with asphalt and with the focus on more or less on New York City. But I have to tell you up front, really, the problems New York City has with their roads is not unique. We also have them in Madison. It's all over the place. So I'll talk a little bit about where does this material come from? Why do we have so many problems with it? And what are the solutions that are available for us today? So I borrowed some information about New York City from a very good resource called the National Transportation Research, TRIP, it's called. It's a nonprofit, and it really monitors the quality of the roads and, you know, kind of alert us to some of the challenges we face in transportation. So TRIP says that 47% of major locally and state maintained roads and highway in New York State are in poor or mediocre condition. So what does it mean it's poor or mediocre? Well, our cars suffer from that, we suffer from it, and eventually these roads are cut to be repaired and replaced. Most of you probably know where the money comes from. It comes from the fuel tax. So every time any one of us go to a gas station, you put fuel, some of that money goes to maintain the road. There's the transportation trust fund that is managed, or some people jokingly say mismanaged by the federal government. They send money back to the states and we build our roads. So in New York, the bad roads or mediocre roads is costing on average about $600 a year, which amounts to 7.2 billion statewide. And you know, some of us say, well, 600, that's about $50 a month. Is that really big deal? Well, it's probably not a big deal until you start looking at, you know, how much we spend time sitting in our car doing very little except getting so much frustrated. So if you count this time of delay or lost time and wasted fuel, it amounts to $14.2 billion each. You can probably tell where is that wasted fuel going. It's being burned by these wonderful engines of the vehicle and then transformed into very bad material being pushed into the environment that causes all the damage that you heard about today. So this is a serious problem. Congested road and mediocre roads, it's causing a lot of problems from really human impact as well as the climate impact. So in most congested urban areas in New York City, drivers lose about $2,000 and as many as 92 hours per year sitting in congestion. 92 hours, that's, you know, probably, almost 2 or more weeks of working time that these people can take as vacation or can be used for being more productive, being lost just because we are not able to manage our roads. So what is the problem here? Is it really the number of lanes or the number of miles that we have, or is it something else? Let's look back at the history of roads. This is a real picture from the Federal Highway Administration taken in the 1930s. Every time it rains, dirt roads becomes impassable. You cannot pass on them. So that concept is not new. In fact, the Romans controlled their empire by building better ways of commuting from one country to the other or from one village to the other. So transportation or mobility is extremely important in our lives today. We have to move from one place to the other to get to work or back to home. And people say, well, why don't you live in the same place you work? I wish we all can. I mean, look at New York City. The cost of living in New York City became so high, although they kept building taller and taller buildings, people were pushed out to live outside of the city, and then they have to commute back into the city. So there is a very significant need to understand what is this road and how it's built so that we can understand how we can contribute to building better roads or actually keeping our roads in a good shape and so on. So the concept of road is very simple. Here is a tire of a vehicle or typically a truck, because most of the damage honestly comes from the truck. It's not you and I, driving our little cars. Most of the damage comes from the truck. This can include buses. It includes, some of these garbage trucks, the recycling trucks, and so on. So anyway, there's a big load that the natural earth needs to tolerate. And in most cases around this country, most of the dirt roads cannot tolerate very heavy loads. So we build up the road by putting layers and layers so that the load coming from the truck can be very gently transported into much larger area that can be tolerated by the natural ground. We also have to seal the road so that when the rain comes, it goes into the storm sewer, not goes into the dirt and make it weaker and so on. So from the 1940s and 1930s, we understood how to build roads so that we can drive faster and we can bring more goods on the trucks without damaging the roads that we can work on. So why are we talking about asphalt? I mean, the Romans never had asphalt when they built their roads. Well, when the crude oil started becoming a source of fuel and we start refining crude oil, we discovered after you take all the gasolines and the different fuels and all the lubricating oils, what's left at the bottom of the barrel is something sticky that we call tar. And then we turned from tar into bitumen. And from bitumen, we turned it into what's called today asphalt. Well, guess what? More than 90% of the road in this country are built with asphalt for good reasons. Some of them we like it, some of them we don't. So roads are necessary for economic growth, access to health, and affordable housing. There's no question about that. So, the idea of, well, let's get rid of roads, we're going to have to build probably other way of transportation. But as we speak today, it appears roads are the most possible way of transporting goods as well as people. In the US, we have over 2.7 million miles of paved roads. That's a lot of roads that we as a country built with the intention of connecting our country, making us more productive, making us safer, and making us live where we want to live and work where we want to live. So it's not really a simple thing. So approximately 94% of all paved roads are built with asphalt. New York is not an exception. In fact, New York State has 98.6% of the road with asphalt. So we need to understand asphalt to really manage our transportation needs. So where does it come from? There are few sources of asphalt, but believe it or not, it comes from the ground. When we get the oil from the oil well, and pump it up and clean it and then refine it. You probably heard of the term, there is, an oil refinery here and there's an oil refinery there, and all over the country, there are many oil refineries. We get the light distillate, which are the gasolines, the diesel oils that we use. Then we get some of the medium and heavy distillate, which are the lubricating oil. And what's left, which is the bottom of the barrel, is actually converted into asphalt. So who discovered asphalt can actually be used in roads? Well, the same people that actually started selling the gasoline discovered, look, there is this leftover, we don't know what to do with it. It turned out this is a very good natural glue, and they start spreading it on the roads to really support the transportation network. So it's a natural product. So what's the problem? The problem is you cannot control its properties. If you get a crude oil from Western California, from Northern California, and you get a crude oil from Alaska, their asphalts become different after they refine it. And you cannot change that. You can treat the asphalt after it's done. So properties of asphalts to produce a high quality asphalt, you can go knock on the door of the refinery and say, look, we're really tired of these bad roads. Can you please give us a good asphalt? Well, good luck with that. The asphalt production at a typical refinery constitute only 2 to 2.5% of the total profit generation in a refinery. There is no one in the right mind in the refinery that'll tell you, don't worry about it. I'm going to send you tomorrow the best asphalt we can produce. It does not happen. They look at the gasoline and the prices of gasoline. They look at other petrochemicals, but they don't want to get even close to the asphalt. They're going to just pump it out and let the pavement road engineers deal with it. So it is not a synthetic material. You cannot cook up asphalt in a lab or in a factory and give it to people. It is not how it's done today. It is what's left over from these crude oils is being pumped to us. So where does the asphalt in Wisconsin comes from? Well, most of it comes actually from a refinery in Minnesota. Where does New York City asphalt comes from? Believe it or not, most of it comes from Canada, because Canada has heavy crudes that are processed very close to the border, and they ship it by rail, and then pavement engineer have to deal with it. So the problem is integral to the nature of this material. So how do we build roads? We don't build roads with asphalt. This is the black sticky stuff, the black glue, as I call it, is not the material we build the road with. We actually mix it with rocks. We have fine rocks, coarse rocks, and create what's called hot mix asphalt. And that material is actually what you drive on or what you walk on, if your sidewalk is an asphalt, and so on. This, by far, from an engineering point of view, the most complex composite material that you can ever imagine, or you can give to an engineer to look at it. The reason is, what you're using is all natural material. This is black sticky stuff that sometimes come from Canada, sometimes come from California. It has all kinds of different properties. And then the rocks also are natural. So if you're in Wisconsin, you're going to probably get some granite, some sandstone, and some other things. We crush it in a very crude way. And then here is the poor engineer sitting, trying to put all of this together to give you a pavement that would last very long. Well, guess what? The innovation in engineering has no limits, honestly. We've been building roads with hot mix asphalt for more than 70 years. Some of them really, really perform very well. And if we apply the engineering principles to build this very, very strange composite material, we can actually have pavement that lasts very long, if you will. So when you build it, we don't put all the layers in asphalt because it's very expensive. Although it's a byproduct, it still costs much more than the natural rocks that we have. So you see these big projects, whether it's New York City or here in Wisconsin, coming these big machines come and roll over and come back and forth and so on. Pavements are a layered system. So this is a natural poor, very poor subgrade, the natural ground. So this is the foundation. So we build a layer of natural aggregates, then we put different layers of asphalt based on cost optimization until we give you a very smooth surface, yet is very safe. It will allow friction with your tire so that when you hit the brakes, it can stop, yet it actually can last longer and move the water and some of the other things away from the road so that it can last very long. So asphalt mixtures are needed for these roads, and we have to be very smart in selecting them. So roads are not only for heavy trucks. We need to distribute the load, but we need to seal the soil, the dirt under the pavement from water, making it really very, very soft. We also want smoothness. None of us would like to drive in a car and all these bumps on the road. In fact, we like them to be much smoother so that we can get, 50 miles, 60 miles. And I think you all noticed, the interstate highways between here and Chicago and many other places, we just increased even the speed limit to 70 miles per hour. So the challenge is how to build these roads to give you the smoothness, give you the safety, but last longer, and so on. So we have many theories of how to select the layers, how to select the materials. There are tons of computer softwares today that actually help us to decide, do I need this thickner? Do I need a less thicker pavement? How long is it going to last? We can predict how much it lasts. So let's talk a little bit, 5 minutes, about what are the bad behaviors of asphalt cement. I think you all know it. I'm sure you've been on a road where there are so many ruts in it. There are, the surface is not homogeneous, and your car bumps up and down and so on, or even your bike will bump up and down and so on. But you also see cracks on the side of the road, and you see cracks in the middle of the road. So what has happened the last 50 years or so, our technology of qualifying the asphalt from the refinery, whether it's coming from Canada or whether it's coming from California or even coming from Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, or from Venezuela. We import asphalt from all kinds of places. As long as the cost is competitive, we'll bring it in. So the engineers were very hard on saying, look, we know this is a natural material, but we're going to select these materials that will fit our needs based on the amount of traffic, based on the climate. Climate of New York is, not really exactly the same as Madison. New York is much wetter environment. We are a much colder environment. Well, guess what happens when it's colder? You get more of these cracks across the road, even though you're trying your best to really improve it and so on. So what is bad about asphalt? It's very temperature sensitive. This is a material that actually its modulus, its hardness, changes by 10,000 times between summer and winter. When I tell these people that this material changes by 10,000 orders of magnitude, they say, "What, are you crazy? There's no such a material." It is the material that we use today. And that is the challenge, is to take this material with all its bad behavior and use it. And people say, well, why don't you go to a synthetic material? It's cost. We're already running out of money, and you can hear all the political debate about, we need $1.5 trillion for infrastructure and so on. There is so much money needed to really fix this road and make them work better. In addition to the temperature sensitivity, this material changes behavior depending on how fast you're driving. The worst thing that can happen is a truck moving very slowly, stopping at a traffic light. That is the most damaging probably behavior for any asphalt road and so on. So the challenges are there, but there are very good engineering theories to fix them. Another really trivia about asphalt is considered a live material. Why do we say that? It ages with time, believe it or not. It's an organic material. It takes up oxygen from the environment, react with it and become more brittle, create more cracks, as you can see here. So we actually developed ways of cooking the asphalt and trying to find out if the asphalt from Canada will cook better than the asphalt from California, and so on and so forth. So what are we doing about this? I described the problem with this wonderful natural material that is very cost effective in most people's opinion. Well, the federal government spent tremendous amount of money in the late 1980s and the beginning 1990s. And actually that, by coincidence, is when I got my PhD. And that's how I attracted to this asphalt business. I had no intentions getting a road until I saw all the technology and all the innovation being put in controlling a natural material that we all need to move from home to work, to take our kid or our parent to the hospital and so on. We need to understand this material. And that's what attracted me. And that's what the university hired me to do, is to train new engineers to really understand this. So we used the most innovative technologies in the 80s and the 90s, and we keep improving them to be very specific. How do you build it? How do you maintain it in the summer? How do you maintain it in the winter? How do you maintain it in the spring? In a very specific way. And what we developed is something called performance grading of asphalt. Very fundamental, detailed engineering concept that went into this. Every refinery in this country, as well as a few other countries, Canada, Mexico, and some of the countries in the Middle East now, getting the hang of this new technology, qualifies asphalt before they ship it to the project. Our DOTs have seen tremendous improvement in the quality based on this technology. So something to take away with you from this very short lecture. Performance grading is actually very sensible. Asphalt is sensitive to temperature. So we grade it by climate, believe it or not. So if you say, well, I'm going to use on my driveway a PG 58 minus 28, that means that asphalt you selected or you ordered is fit for a summer condition of 58 degrees Celsius and a winter condition of minus 28 degrees Celsius. And somebody told me, are you out of your mind? Air never reaches 58 degrees Celsius. This is like, is intolerable, which is true. But asphalt is a black body. It absorbs the solar energy. And if you walked on a blacktop barefooted, you can remember very well that it's much, much warmer than the air temperature. So the system, believe it or not, that's all this engineering innovation with money from the federal government and many of the states is very sensible. Climate affects asphalt and traffic affect asphalt, and that's how we specify asphalt. So there is hope that this continuously improving method of classifying this natural material will help us maintain our roads in a better way. Better roads reduce emissions, reduce the effect of climate change. If you look at any literature, and my colleagues that work in the sustainability or the environmental institute can tell you, the burning of fuel from transportation is one of the most important sources of really CO2 and other damaging gases, if you will. So what did we discuss today? Roads are very important for society, and 90% of it are built with asphalt. The more we get people to understand this material, the more we train our technicians, our engineers to really use the innovations, the less there will be congestion, because we will not have to maintain the road as many. Many of you have heard this term that in Wisconsin, actually, there are only 2 seasons. It's winter and construction. Well, you know very well construction, they mean road construction. We need to get out of that. Asphalt bad behavior can cause all of these problems, but there are new ideas and new technology that could help us actually produce better roads. So why are our roads improving? They are actually improving. If you talk to anyone in our Department of Transportation, they will tell you we are paying a little bit more, but we are getting better roads. And you ask them, why are you paying more? They will tell you because the fuel tax is not high enough. If you want to reduce emissions, if you want to keep ourselves, driving on very good roads, we're going to have to pay for it. That's just simple reality. So good roads can be constructed with good asphalt. There is no question about it. And we can do much more. The term probably some of you have heard is super pave. And if you have a computer, you can Google it. Just Google super pave technology. You will see the amazing things that more than 200 universities in this country worked together in the late 80s and early 90s to produce one of the most sophisticated, and I think one of the most effective method of controlling quality of asphalt. If you're on campus and you want to visit the asphalt lab that this great university has built, please give me a call, drop me an email. I'll show you something that people really will enjoy seeing, and it's very sensible. If you don't want to come on campus, here are some of the websites that you can review if you're interested in this. Thank you again for listening, and I'll turn it back to Dan. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank all the presenters. And I learned a lot, as I always do. That's one of the perks of organizing SoundWaves, is getting to hear every presentation. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief if I can. Well, I'll try to do that. I'm not that good at that, so that we can get to hearing some music. So New York City is obviously a cultural destination. So let's say you go to New York and you see a Broadway show, and they're really great. And your reaction to the show is, wow, the costumes were amazing. The singing was great. The show was so engaging. I've never seen anything like that. The music was good. And the orchestra sounded good. But behind that, from the point of view of the orchestra, is a whole bunch of freelance musicians in New York City. And I was one of those musicians for almost 25 years. So I thought I'd give you a little sneak peek into what it's like to be one of these people that's running around New York City playing concerts, shows, ballets, operas, chamber music concerts, new music concerts, concerts for huge audiences, concerts for tiny audiences. And I moved to New York. I went to college and I graduated, and I had a little dalliance in Paris. And then I ran out of money and I thought, okay, I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to be a freelance horn player. And so I got to New York and I found an apartment and I had a phone, although not a cell phone. And I thought, now I'm a freelance horn player. But of course, nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew that I was there. And freelancing is a world of connections. The freelance music business is the most social business that I've ever seen. Everything that you do comes about because of your relationships with your fellow musicians. Most of the work that I did over 20 years came from my fellow horn players, or could be traced back to my fellow horn players. So how does it all happen? Well, I'm sure if Dostoevsky had written a novel about French horn players, he would have had some great opening line about how all French horn careers begin in a different way. And it's definitely true. My story was I auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. I didn't win the audition. This was so long ago that the person who won the audition has now retired. And I did well in the audition, though. I advanced through the rounds, and I met a guy in the semifinals, and he said, "Who are you? I've never seen you." And he was much older than I, and I explained who I was, and he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "I live in New York." And he said, "Why don't I know you?" And I said, "Well, I'm brand new." And he said, "Well, you must be good if you're here and you made the semifinals of this audition. Would you like to sub in my show?" And I said, I was so excited. Work. Paying work. And he had me in to sub at his show, which was called City of Angels. And this was back in the late 80s. Great show. I mentioned in my earlier remarks about having to adapt and learn kind of on the fly. And this show had a jazz score, and I'd never played jazz before in my life. And some of the best jazz musicians in New York were the pit musicians for this show. So I sat there and I had to use a tool that had really been refined for me by my practicing, but mostly by my teachers and my coaches in my education. And that tool was my ears and trying to fit into the situation that I was put in. Now, you might say, what about rehearsing? Well, there's no rehearsals because the show plays night after night after night. The orchestra is not rehearsing. They rehearse for maybe a week or two before the show opens. And then after that, they don't rehearse. So if you're a sub at a show, you sit next to the regular player, looking over his or her shoulder at the horn part or the violin part or whatever your instrument, and you watch it all go by. And then the next time you go in, you play it. And that's it. That's a performance. So it has to be right from the start. So it rewards people who can adapt. And the freelance community is filled with people who can adapt. They can play a Broadway show in any style. They can play in a band with Arun Luthra and then go the next night and play at the Metropolitan Opera. And that was what my career was in New York. It was constantly different. So I ended up playing in a group called Meridian Arts Ensemble that was a brass quintet and then became a brass quintet plus percussion, and is still going. I'm still in it, back to a brass quintet. And we played a lot of contemporary music, which means very, very complicated rhythmic music, and everything with new sounds, and we had to make sense of it ourselves. And of course, in a chamber group, there's nobody telling you how to play, so you have to learn how to interpret a new piece that's never been played before. So I did some of that. Then we started playing some rock and roll, which I'd never played in my life and had barely listened to. So I launched on a project of listening to a lot of music and getting to know a lot of music and being able to create that kind of music. We ended up playing a lot of music by Frank Zappa, which members of the group arranged. And we ended up getting to play that music at Frank Zappa's house for him and having him work with us on it. And again, adapt. Someone new tells you how to play their music. You change constantly on the fly. And you're always having personal relationships with your fellow musicians, and very intense relationships in which you're listening to every single thing that they do. How do they start a note? How do they end a note? What do they do in between? It's an intensity of work that I think is probably unrivaled in many businesses. The thing about the musician pool in New York is that they're all there because they love music. They're all creative people. And yet in New York City, as several of our presenters have mentioned, it's an expensive city. It's hard to get around. As a freelancer, you're going to a new place every time. As a musician, you're not making that much money, so you're not living right by Lincoln Center, because a one-bedroom apartment near Lincoln Center will cost you $4,000 a month in rent, and musicians are not paying $4,000 a month in rent. So you're commuting, and yet you're in it for the creative side. So how do musicians find their creativity? Well, I'll tell you what I did. First of all, playing in my own group where I had some control over what we played. And actually, because we did a lot of arranging, I started arranging music for that group. So that on Thursday night, I would go and I would sub at Phantom of the Opera, and that would be for the 473rd time. But earlier in the day, I would have rehearsed with my group, and we would have played a new arrangement that I had worked on. So I was getting nourished by that at the same time as I was getting my paycheck from Phantom of the Opera. I actually played in 36 different shows on Broadway in my time in New York. 2 of them were my own show where I was getting my own subs when I couldn't be there. And the rest, I was a sub, which was a situation that I much preferred because you didn't have 8 shows a week hanging over you. You could go in and out as when you were free. So a typical week would look like Monday, go to my teaching job. Tuesday, go to my other teaching job and then play a show at night. Wednesday, have a rehearsal for an orchestra gig, then have a rehearsal with my group, play a show at night. Thursday, have the concert for the orchestra thing and have another rehearsal with my group. So adapting, changing, different circumstances, different people. Every single time I took my horn out of the case. And it's exhausting and it's nourishing and it's wonderful and it's terrible. All of those things put together. But the greatest thing about it is that the people form a society that helps each other. I read an article that described it as the favor bank. So I have a show and I can't make the show on Wednesday afternoon next week. So I call my friend Steve and I say, can you play my show for me next Wednesday afternoon? And can you come watch the book, and get ready to play it tomorrow night? And he says, sure. And now I've done him a favor because I've earned him $200 and he's done me a favor because he's helping me out to do my other gig that I can't do, that I want to do. And I have a show. So now we're networked together. We each have helped each other, done a solid good turn for each other, and multiply this by maybe when I was in New York, about 110 French horn players who were working a lot, all intertwined, all helping each other to do all of the duties that they have, and all being helped. We had a horn player who had a child who needed a lot of medical attention, and that horn player worked every night for years and years and years. Everybody made sure that she was working so that she could make enough money to take care of the medical expenses of her child. So the nourishing quality of the fellow musicians is just incredible. But back to creativity, I found myself often thinking I'm just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So the last show that I had in New York was South Pacific. It was a beautiful show, I think, although I never saw it, but I certainly heard it from underneath many, many times. It was at Lincoln Center, and the theater at Lincoln Center, unlike the Broadway theaters, which, by the way, those Broadway theaters look very glamorous from the audience perspective and quite unglamorous from the perspective of the backstage and the orchestra, where you're packed in like sardines. But in this very large pit at South Pacific, there was room. There was a lot of space. And I had been teaching a class at one of the schools I taught at on the music business and stressing to my students, you want to be a musician, you need your projects. You need to think of stuff to do and go do it and nourish yourself in that way. And then here I was in this pit playing the same tunes over and over and over again. So we had a lot of downtime when there was dialogue in the show. So I wrote an etude book, a book of studies for horn, while I was in the pit in my downtime, and started a little teeny publishing company to publish my own stuff. And then that was fun. So then the show went on. And so I wrote another one. And that one was really fun because it's called the Quarter Tone Manual for Horn. So it's about quarter tones, which are notes in between the half steps. And they sound pretty funny to people's ears. And I had a colleague who loved watching me write these etudes. So during the first half of the show, I would write a new etude, and then I would put it on his stand at intermission, and he would play it for me. And they sounded really strange. And the 7 people left in the theater who weren't running to the bathroom to try to, use the toilet before the end of intermission looked down at us like, what on earth is going on down there? but I was able in that way to do stuff that meant something to me musically, while also making the money necessary to live and to live in New York City. So next time you're in the city and you go see an orchestra, if you go see the New York Philharmonic, most of the people you see are members of the New York Philharmonic, and that's their regular job, and that's what they do. But there's probably some extra players, and they come from this community of freelancers. And now they're jumping into the New York Philharmonic and having to adapt like that to the circumstances that they find themselves in. This is the joy of the music business. It's exhausting. And one great way out of it is to apply for a teaching job where you take all the things that you were doing before and you move them under one roof. And even if that roof is the roof of the humanities building, that can be very, very satisfying as well. So thank you for listening. And I would like to bring Arun Luthra's band back to the stage. And while they're coming up, I would just, would like to thank Shauna Baranczyk, who's running the tech here. And again, the behind the scenes stuff is hopefully invisible to audiences, whether it's in a Broadway show or an opera or a circus, but there's so much tech work that goes behind the scenes and you're just amazing. So thank you so much. Second. Okay. I also just quickly want to thank Laura Heisler. She is my partner. She helps me plan these events. She's in charge of all the productions here on the ground floor at Discovery. I couldn't do it without her. She was here at the beginning. I'm not sure if she's still here. She's still here in the back. Laura, thank you. I couldn't do it without you. Thanks to Arun and the band and to all the presenters. And feel free to come up and talk to Robbie afterwards if you have questions. And I'm not sure if we'll be able to ask questions of the people, the other presenters somehow. If they're still on, come on up over here to this table if you want to ask them questions. Thank you.
Quick practical question, Dan. Is it a hard stop at 6 o'clock? Okay. Okay, well, so we're going to conclude this program with a suite called Monarchs of Queens. Queens being one of the boroughs of New York City and also happens to be my home borough. I was composer in residence at Flushing Town Hall in Queens, and I composed this suite based on the history of the amazing musicians who called Queens home. Queens became an incredible center of Black American culture in the mid-20th century. And pretty much anyone who's anyone that you can think of at some point lived in Queens in this musical tradition. So Louis Armstrong, most famously, Cannonball Adderley, Charles Mingus, Ray Brown, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald. It just goes on. The list goes on and on and on. So this suite is dedicated to some members of that incredible community. And this first movement is called Cannonball, Little Bird, and Mumbles. Cannonball is Julian Adderley, Little Bird is Jimmy Heath, and Mumbles is Clark Terry. And they all lived in the Dory Miller houses, named after the first African-American US Navy sailor to be awarded a medal for bravery. He saved many of his fellow sailors during the Pearl Harbor attacks at a time when Black sailors were not allowed to serve in combat roles. So one of the great heroes of the civil rights movement, who's not widely known, and there's a housing complex named after him called the Dory Miller Houses, where Cannonball, Little Bird, and Mumbles lived. Thank you. Johannes Wallman, tearing it up. John Christensen also tearing it up. And Matt Endres swinging the hell out of it and tearing it up. Okay, this next movement is dedicated to John Coltrane, and I call it John and Nicholas on Mexico Street. Coltrane lived on Mexico Street in Queens, and it's a time when he was really into a book which many musicians have studied from called Thesaurus of Melodic Patterns. Is that right, Johannes? The Slimsky book? Thesaurus of Melodic Scales and Patterns. It's something like that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm having a, say it again? Yes. Yes, Nicholas Slimsky. And therefore, you know, Coltrane was just practicing out of that book constantly at this time in his career. So, and he was living on Mexico Street, so I call it John and Nicholas on Mexico Street. Thank you very much. This next movement is dedicated to the great Billie Holiday and the incredible Mal Waldron. They were very close friends, and Mal Waldron was Billie's accompanist the last 2 years of her life. Billie's life is such a tragic story, and yet she was able to transcend that tragedy and create this incredible, timeless beauty. And Mal and Billie together wrote a song called Left Alone, which is an absolutely heartbreaking song, which they never recorded together. But thinking of that, I composed this movement called Billie and Mal's Loneliness.
Johannes Wallman. All right, we got one more for you. And this movement is dedicated to the man we call Pops in the Black American music community, Louis Armstrong, a longtime Queens resident. He made his home in Corona, and I call this Pops of Corona. I'm gonna march you on out of here with some second line. All right. Dom, dom. taki the taki the takadina tak the takada dim takadim taki the tadim 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 the takadim 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 down June the taki the takadim takadim tadim tadim tadim. Johannes Wallman, John Christensen, Matt Endres. My name is Arun Luthra. Dan, thank you for having us. It's so much fun. Thank you to all the presenters. Thank you all for coming out. Hello to everybody in internet land, and hope to see you again soon.